The papers were heavier than they should have been. I kept telling myself that as I walked down the long corridor of the Iron Veil Pack's main hall, that the weight I felt in my hands was just the thickness of the documents, the formality of legal language pressed onto parchment, nothing more. Not grief. Not the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from loving someone who stopped seeing you long before he stopped looking at you. The corridor smelled the same as it always had. Cedar and old leather and something sharper underneath. Pine resin, maybe. Or the particular scent of power that clung to every surface in a place where the Alpha King lived. I had spent 3 years learning that smell, waking up inside it, believing for a time that it meant safety. I adjusted my cloak with one hand and kept the folder pressed against my chest with the other. The wool was rough against my fingers, familiar in the way that small discomforts become anchors when everything else feels uncertain. Outside, the sky was the color of pewter, heavy with clouds that hadn't decided yet whether to open. September in the Northern Territories always felt like a held breath. I was 24 years old, 8 months along, and I had come to end my marriage. The guard at the inner door, a beta named Cole, broad-shouldered and careful-eyed, saw me first. His reaction was the one I had been bracing for since I crossed the border 3 hours ago. His gaze dropped. It always did. People looked at the evidence before they looked at the woman, and right now the evidence was impossible to miss beneath my traveling cloak. "Luna June," he said, and his voice was strange, careful in the way voices get when someone doesn't know whether to call a healer or simply step aside. "I'm not the Luna anymore," I said quietly. "I haven't been for 7 months." He opened the door without another word. 7 months ago, Sebastian had handed me a letter. Not spoken the words, handed me a letter, folded in thirds, sealed with the Iron Veil crest, as though it were official pack business, and not the dissolution of everything we had built together. I remembered the texture of the paper under my thumb. Heavy stock. Expensive. The kind used for treaties and declarations. The bond between us no longer serves the pack. I am initiating formal separation proceedings. You will be escorted to Westmeir by the end of the week. 12 lines. I had counted them 4 times. I had not told him about the pregnancy. I had only found out 2 days before, and I had been trying to find the right moment, the right words, the right version of myself that felt brave enough to say, "Something has changed," to a man who had already decided that everything between us was finished. And then the letter arrived, and the right moment collapsed into something I couldn't rebuild. I left on the 4th day. Not the 5th, not the 7th. I didn't wait for the escort. I packed one bag, and I walked out of Iron Veil Keep before sunrise, while the mist was still low on the hills, and the wolves on night patrol were changing shifts. Nobody stopped me. That was perhaps the thing that stayed with me longest. Not the letter, not the silence of the weeks before it, but the simple fact that nobody stopped me. June Vassar, Omega, former Luna of the Iron Veil Pack, walked out of her own life at dawn, and the world didn't even pause. Westmeir was a border town with gray walls and a weekly market, and a healer named Soren, who asked no questions and charged honest prices. I found a room above a candle shop on the 2nd day. The smell of beeswax and warm wick became the smell of my new beginning, modest and quiet, and entirely mine. I learned the rhythms of a smaller life. I woke early and walked the market before the crowds came, buying vegetables and bread, and occasionally a small jar of honey that I couldn't really afford. I helped Mira, the candlemaker downstairs, with her inventory on Thursdays, and she gave me dinner in exchange, and never once asked about the ring I no longer wore or the reasons behind the careful way I held myself, like someone who had been shattered and was still figuring out which pieces fit where. The pregnancy I carried alone. Not unhappily. That surprised me, actually, how much of it was not unhappy. There was something clarifying about it, something that cut through the grief and the confusion and the long months of feeling invisible inside my own marriage. This was real. This was certain. Whatever Sebastian had decided about us, about our bond, about the future of his pack. This was a truth he hadn't been part of making, and hadn't been consulted about, and couldn't revise with 12 lines on expensive paper. Still, he had a right to know. That was why I had come back, not for myself. I had made a kind of peace with Westmeir, with beeswax and Thursday dinners, and the particular dignity of surviving things that were supposed to break you. But the child I was carrying would be born into a world with rules, with hierarchies, with pack structures that would define its place before it drew its first breath. An Alpha King's child, unacknowledged, unregistered. That was a cruelty I refused to pass along. Whatever my feelings about Sebastian, whatever the state of the papers in my hands, this was not about us anymore. It was about what came after us. So I had drafted a letter to his beta, a man named Darian, who had always been quietly decent to me, and I had said, I need 1 hour. I will come in person. I have documents to sign and a matter to discuss. I had not explained the matter. I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that the brevity would be enough, that Sebastian would be too proud to ask questions in advance, too accustomed to control to admit uncertainty, that he would simply agree to the meeting because refusing would mean admitting he was afraid of it. He had agreed within a day. The inner hall was smaller than I remembered, or maybe I was just different now, less easily impressed by high ceilings and dark wood, and the particular staging of power that pack leaders used to remind everyone of the distance between themselves and the rest of the world. 2 large tables ran parallel down the center of the room, maps and documents spread across them in organized disorder. A fire burned in the far hearth, low and steady. Candles on iron brackets. The smell of cedar again, deeper here, almost overwhelming. Darian was standing near the window when I entered. He was in his mid-30s, dark-haired, with the kind of face that absorbed shock without showing it. He had been Sebastian's beta for 8 years. He had seen things that would have undone most people. He saw me. For exactly 3 seconds, he didn't move. Then, June. His voice was very controlled. Darian didn't realize. It's all right, I said, because it was easier to make other people comfortable than to stand inside their discomfort. Old habit. Omega habit. Is he here? Darian opened his mouth, closed it, looked, just briefly, at the folder pressed against my chest, and then, helplessly, at the shape of me beneath my cloak, the truth of it, undeniable, even in the gray wool. He's in the study, he finally said. The door at the far end of the hall opened. Sebastian walked in mid-sentence, speaking to someone behind him, a map half unrolled in his hands, his dark braids pulled back from his face. He was wearing the leather chest piece I recognized from patrol seasons, the one with the crossed straps, worn soft with use. His eyes were already moving toward Darian, already framing the next sentence of whatever conversation he'd been continuing. Then he saw me. The map stopped. The sentence stopped. Sebastian Voss, Alpha King of the Iron Vale territories, a man I had watched face down rival packs and council challenges, and the particular brutality of political winters without blinking, went absolutely, completely still. His gaze moved from my face to the folder in my hands. Then, slowly, the way someone looks at something they are trying to convince themselves they are misreading, down to the shape of me beneath the gray wool. The silence in the room was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I lifted my chin. I did not let my hands shake. I came to sign the papers, I said, and to tell you something you had a right to know. Nobody moved for what felt like a very long time. I counted the seconds the way I had learned to count them during the harder moments of my marriage. Not as a way of measuring duration, but as a way of staying inside my own body when everything in me wanted to retreat somewhere smaller and safer. 1, 2, 3. The fire crackled in the hearth. Somewhere outside, wind pressed against the leaded windows, and the glass shivered faintly in its frame. Sebastian had not looked away from me. I had prepared for many versions of this moment during the long weeks in Westmeir. I had imagined coldness, the particular kind he was capable of, distant and administrative, the way he handled things that were inconvenient. I had imagined irritation, maybe even controlled anger, because Sebastian's anger was never loud, never thrown across rooms. It was quiet and pressurized, like something sealed in a container too small for it. I had imagined, in my worst moments, indifference. I had not imagined this. His face had gone through something I couldn't quite name. Not one expression. Several, moving beneath the surface like weather systems colliding. His jaw was tight. His eyes, those pale, ice-blue eyes that had always looked through walls and people and pretense with equal efficiency, were fixed on me with an intensity that made the back of my neck warm. Behind him, the man he'd been speaking with, one of the patrol captains, a senior beta named Rowan, tall and weathered, had stopped in the doorway and was doing the same thing Darian had done. Looking, understanding, going very still. "Give us the room," Sebastian said. His voice was even, controlled. But there was something underneath it that I felt more than heard, a low frequency, like the first pressure change before a storm arrives. Darian moved without hesitation. Rowan stepped back through the doorway and pulled it shut behind him. In seconds, the hall was empty, except for the two of us and the fire, and the particular weight of everything we hadn't said to each other in 7 months. Sebastian set the half-rolled map down on the nearest table. Slowly, deliberately. The way he did everything when he was working to maintain composure. Then he looked at me again. "June," he said. "Just my name. Nothing after it. Sebastian." I kept my voice steady. I had practiced this. "I won't take much of your time. I have the separation documents. Darian's legal contact prepared them. I've reviewed them. I just need your signature and mine on the final 3 pages, and then this is finished, and we can both move forward." I was talking too fast. I knew it. I pressed the folder against my chest a little harder and made myself slow down. "After that," I continued, "I'll explain the other matter, and then I'll leave, and you won't have to. You won't need to see me again unless you choose to." The room was very quiet. Sebastian hadn't moved from where he stood, 3 strides away from me, the table between us like a deliberate geography. But his eyes had dropped again, briefly, to the shape of my cloak. And when they came back up to my face, there was something different in them. Something cracked open. "How long?" he said. "Not what is the other matter. Not whose is it. Not even." And this was the thing that undid something small and guarded inside me. Not "why didn't you tell me?" Just, how long? 8 months, I said. I watched him absorb it, watched the calculation move behind his eyes. 8 months ago, 6 weeks before the letter. 2 months into the silence that had grown between us in the last season of our marriage like a living thing, taking up space, breathing the air out of rooms. He had known, on some level, what that silence was. We both had. A marriage going quiet is not a sudden event. It is a series of small withdrawals, small surrenders, small moments when someone chooses not to reach across a distance that is growing incrementally. We had both been making those choices. I had told myself it was his fault for pulling away first. He had probably told himself something that served his own narrative equally well. That was how it worked, between 2 people who were too proud and too tired to say the true things out loud. "You left," he said. Before I could. "You sent me a letter," I said, quietly, without heat, because I had spent 7 months burning through the heat and what was left was something cooler and more durable. 12 lines, sealed with the official crest. His jaw moved. Something shifted in his expression that he didn't entirely manage to suppress. "I know," he said. Those 2 words landed differently than I expected. I had been ready for justification, for the logical architecture of reasons that alpha men build around their decisions, the structural arguments that make everything that hurt you sound like a policy decision. The pack needed. The bond had weakened. The council required. I had rehearsed my responses to all of it. I know was not in any of my rehearsals. I looked at him for a moment. At the tight line of his shoulders, and the map abandoned on the table, and the fire behind him throwing his shadow long across the floor. He looked, in that moment, less like the Alpha King of the Iron Vale territories, and more like a man standing inside a mistake he was only now understanding the full dimensions of. I did not let that soften me. I had learned the hard way that understanding the shape of a wound and healing from it were entirely separate processes. "The documents," I said, and held out the folder. He took it, opened it, read, actually read, not skimmed, which surprised me. Sebastian had always been thorough, even when thoroughness was uncomfortable. It was one of the things I had once admired about him, back when admiration was still something I had easy access to. While he read, I moved toward the fire, not toward him. I was careful about the geography, but the cold had been in my bones since the road, and the child I was carrying had been pressing restlessly against my ribs since morning, and I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the journey. I stood with my back to him, hands extended toward the warmth, and let myself breathe. The room had a different quality from this angle. I could see the maps more clearly. Territorial borders, pack boundaries, the red markings of patrol routes updated recently. There were more red markings than there used to be. Trouble on the eastern edge, maybe, or the southern borders that had always been unstable. Whatever Sebastian's world had been doing in the 7 months since I left, it had not been quiet. I heard the soft sound of pages turning. "The asset division is fair," he said from behind me. "More than fair. You've left most of it." "I don't want most of it," I said. "I want to be done cleanly." A pause. "June." His voice was closer. I hadn't heard him move. "Turn around." I did. He was 2 feet away, the folder held loosely at his side, and he was looking at me the way he almost never had during our marriage, without the armor of authority, without the careful distance of a man who had learned that need was a vulnerability. Just looking. Present in the way that he had stopped being present somewhere in our 2nd year together. When the pack pressures had built up and the council had grown louder, and the space between his responsibilities and his private self had quietly eliminated everything in between. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't." I met his gaze. "I'm not here to assign blame for that. I'm here because this child will be born in 6 weeks and will carry Iron Vale blood and deserves to be acknowledged. That's all. You can be whatever kind of father you choose to be. Involved, distant, formal. That's between you and your own conscience. But the child's status needs to be registered, and you needed to hear it from me directly." Something moved through his expression again, that deep underground weather. His eyes dropped to where my hands rested, folded over the curve of my stomach, and stayed there for a long moment. "A boy or a girl?" he asked. Quietly. "I don't know," I said. "I didn't want to know ahead of time." He nodded, almost imperceptibly. And then he did something I was entirely unprepared for. He reached out, slowly, giving me every chance to step back. The gesture telegraphed so clearly that there was nothing surprising about it, except that it was happening at all, and placed one large hand, very gently, against the side of my rounded stomach. He didn't speak. He just held still, like someone listening. Beneath his palm, the child shifted, a small rolling movement, the kind that had been waking me at 3 a.m. for the past 6 weeks, sudden and undeniable and full of intention. Sebastian's breath caught. I watched it happen. Watched the Alpha King of the Iron Vale territories feel, for the first time, the reality of what existed between all our failures and silences and 12-line letters. And I watched something in his face break open in a way that all the council challenges and rival packs and political winters never had. His eyes came up to mine. And I thought, there it is. There is the thing we never got to. I stepped back, gently but clearly. The last 3 pages need your signature, I said. I'll wait. He didn't sign that night. I hadn't expected that either. Sebastian set the folder down on the table, with the careful deliberateness of a man buying himself time, and then he called for Darian, and Darian appeared in the doorway, with the particular expression of someone who had been standing close enough to the door to hear most of what had passed between us, and was now performing ignorance with limited success. Sebastian asked him, in a voice that invited no discussion, to prepare a room for me in the East Wing. That's not necessary, I said immediately. The road back to Westmeir takes 3 hours, and the sky is closing, Sebastian said. He didn't look at me when he said it. He was already moving back toward the maps on the table, his shoulders set in that familiar way. Not dismissive, but closed, the way a door is closed when someone needs to think. You'll leave in the morning, I wanted to argue. The words were there, the reflex of the woman I had spent 7 months becoming. The one who made her own decisions and didn't wait for permission, and had learned the particular freedom of needing nothing from anyone who hadn't earned it. But outside the window, the pewter sky had darkened to something closer to charcoal, and the wind had found a new register against the glass, and I was 8 months pregnant, and my lower back had been aching since the 2nd hour of the journey. I chose the practical thing. One night, I said. Sebastian nodded at the maps. Darian showed me to the East Wing. The room they gave me was not the one I had shared with Sebastian during our marriage. That had been in the North Tower, with windows that faced the forest, and a bed wide enough to get lost in, and all the complicated history of 2 people trying and failing, and trying again inside the same 4 walls. This room was smaller, simpler, with a single window that looked out over the inner courtyard, and a fire already built, and a wash basin with clean water. It smelled of cedar and dried lavender, and the faint mineral sharpness of old stone. I sat on the edge of the bed, and let myself be tired for the first time all day. Mira had known I was coming back here. She was the only person I had told, and she had stood in the doorway of her candle shop with flour on her hands from the morning baking, and said very simply, "Be careful with your own heart, June. It doesn't always know the difference between the past and the present." I had thought I understood what she meant. Sitting now in the East Wing of Ironvale Keep, with the weight of the day settling into my bones, and the child pressing gently against my ribs, and the image of Sebastian's face when he felt the movement playing in my mind on a quiet loop, I understood it differently. My heart was not confused about the past and the present. My heart was confused about the distance between who Sebastian had been in the worst moments of our marriage and who he had been, for those few seconds, with his hand against my stomach and something cracked open in his expression that I had never seen there before. The problem was that a few seconds did not rewrite 3 years. I knew that. I pressed my palm flat against my stomach and felt the child shift in response. That small, certain presence that had become the most honest thing in my life. And I reminded myself why I had come. Documents, acknowledgement, a clean ending to something that had never been cleanly finished. Not reconciliation, not reopening, not standing in the warmth of Sebastian Voss's attention and forgetting all the nights I had spent invisible inside it. I lay down, still in my traveling clothes, and fell asleep faster than I intended to. I woke to voices. Low, male, tense, coming from somewhere down the corridor, close enough that the edges of the conversation reached me through the old stone walls. I recognized Darian's voice first, then Sebastian's. And a third voice I didn't immediately place, rougher and more agitated than the other 2. I didn't move for a moment, lying in the dark and listening to the shapeless murmur of it, trying to read the emotional temperature without the words. Darian sounded careful. The third voice sounded urgent, almost confrontational. Sebastian sounded the way he did when something was being demanded of him that he had already decided against. Quiet in a way that was more absolute than any raised voice. Then I heard my name. Not the full conversation. Just my name once, in the third voice, with a particular weight on it that didn't feel like concern. It felt like argument. like evidence being presented in a case I hadn't been told was being made. I sat up. The ache in my back had settled to something manageable. The fire had burned down to embers. Outside the window, the courtyard was dark and still, the clouds having finally committed to covering the moon entirely. I had no idea what hour it was. I found my cloak and my shoes, and I opened the door quietly. The corridor was empty. The voices were coming from the room at the far end. One of the smaller council chambers, I remembered, used for conversations that needed privacy without the formality of the main hall. A thin line of candlelight showed under the door. I should have gone back to my room. I knew that. I was a guest here, technically, and not even a welcome one in any official sense, and whatever was being discussed behind that door was not my business, and almost certainly nothing I was equipped to deal with at this hour in this condition. Instead, I stood in the corridor and listened. Can't simply ignore the timing. The third voice, clearer now, I placed it. Councillor Edric, one of the senior Pack Council members, a man in his 60s with sharp eyes and a lifelong investment in Iron Vale's political architecture. She arrives unannounced, 8 months along, carrying what she claims is... Careful. Sebastian's voice, flat and very still. I am being careful. I am being precisely careful, which is more than can be said for this situation. The separation proceedings were initiated months ago. If she attempts to use the pregnancy to contest the dissolution, she isn't contesting anything. Sebastian again. She came to sign. Did she sign? A pause. Not yet, Darian said. Then she hasn't signed. Edric's voice carried the satisfaction of a man making a point he had prepared in advance. Which means the separation is not finalized, which means her status is technically still. Her status, Sebastian said, and now the quietness in his voice had an edge to it, is not a council matter. Everything that affects the line of succession is a council matter. You know that. You have always known that. If that child is... Enough. One word. But the quality of it was different from the controlled quiet of everything before. It had weight and heat, and the particular authority that Sebastian used so rarely that it always landed like a physical thing when it arrived. The kind of voice that ended conversations not by winning arguments, but by removing the possibility of continuation. Silence from the council chamber. I stood very still in the corridor, my back against the cold stone, my heart doing something complicated in my chest. The line of succession. I had not let myself think about that. I had thought about acknowledgement, about the child's status, about the clean logistics of an ending. I had not thought about what it meant, in practical Pack terms, for an Alpha King to have a child. Unregistered, unclaimed, existing in the political gray space of a marriage that was almost but not yet dissolved. I had not thought about what it meant for Sebastian, or what others might try to make it mean. I heard movement inside the chamber, the scrape of a chair, the sound of someone preparing to leave. I pushed off the wall and moved quickly back toward my room, and I had just pulled the door closed behind me when I heard the chamber door open and footsteps pass down the corridor and fade. I stood in the dark of my room, cloak still around my shoulders, and thought about Edric's voice. The careful way he had said what she claims. The way he had let the implication sit in the air without completing it, because a man like that knew that incomplete implications were more corrosive than direct accusations. He wasn't concerned about the child. He was concerned about the complication, about the way my presence here disrupted whatever arrangement the council had built around Sebastian's future in the 7 months since I left. I thought about Sebastian saying enough in that voice. I thought about him not letting Edric finish. I pressed my hand against my stomach in the dark, and the child moved, slow and certain, and I said very quietly to no one in particular, "We are going to be fine." I wasn't entirely sure I believed it, but it felt important to say it out loud, in the dark, in the house of the man who had sent me away with 12 lines on expensive paper, and had not, tonight, been able to look at the shape of what we had made together without something breaking open in him. We were going to be fine. The question was what fine would cost. And who was going to pay it? Morning arrived gray and cold and full of the smell of wood smoke and wet stone. I had slept again, eventually, shallowly, the way I had been sleeping for the last month. Not truly resting, but not truly waking either, existing in the shallow water between one state and the other. When I opened my door, there was a tray on the floor outside it, bread and honey, and a small pot of something hot and dark that turned out to be a herbal blend I recognized. Ginger and chamomile, the kind recommended during the later months of pregnancy. Not tea. The specific blend. Someone had known to bring the specific blend. I picked up the tray and carried it inside and sat by the window and ate, watching the courtyard come to life below. Stable hands, patrol wolves returning from the night shift, the ordinary machinery of a pack morning. And I thought about who, in this house, would have known what kind of tea to send. There was a folded note beneath the honey jar. The council meets at 10. I would like to speak with you before then. I read it twice, set it down, poured the tea. Outside, the clouds were beginning, tentatively, to consider breaking. He was waiting in the library, not the main hall, not the council chamber, not any of the formal spaces where Sebastian Voss typically conducted the business of being who he was. The library was at the back of the keep, a room I had always loved for the specific quality of its silence, the way the shelves absorbed sound, the way the light came through the tall windows and long, dusty columns that made the whole space feel slightly outside of ordinary time. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling. Maps and instruments crowded a large central table. It smelled of paper and beeswax, and the particular intellectual warmth of a room that was actually used, not displayed. Sebastian was standing at the window when I entered, one hand braced against the frame, looking out at the courtyard below. He had changed from last night. No chest armor now, just a dark linen shirt with the sleeves pushed to the elbows, his braids loose over one shoulder. He looked, without the full weight of his official appearance, like someone I had known a long time ago. Before the council, and the territorial pressures, and the 12 lines on expensive paper. I stopped a few feet inside the door, and waited. He turned. "Did you sleep?" he asked. It was such an ordinary question that it disarmed me slightly. "Some," I said. "Enough." He nodded. Looked at me with that new quality in his gaze, the one that had appeared when he felt the child move and hadn't entirely gone away since. Less armored, more present. It made him harder to be in a room with, in certain ways, because the version of Sebastian I had built my defenses against was the distant one, the controlled one, the one who made decisions about our life the way he made decisions about pack borders. Efficiently, with minimal emotional expenditure. This version required a different kind of steadiness from me. "I heard part of what Edric said last night," I told him. "I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. I wasn't eavesdropping intentionally. I woke up and I heard my name." Something moved through his expression, not surprise exactly. More like the particular look of someone who had already assumed this and had been deciding how to address it. "What did you hear?" he asked. "Enough," I said. "He doesn't believe the child is yours." "Edric believes whatever is politically useful to him at any given moment," Sebastian said. His voice was even, but the line of his jaw was tight. "It's his primary skill." That's not a reassuring answer. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He moved away from the window, toward the central table, and stood with his hands resting on the edge of it. The maps were spread beneath his palms, the same territorial charts from last night, with the red patrol markings and the troubled borders. I had a sudden, vivid memory of standing at this same table 2 years ago, when Sebastian had been explaining a boundary dispute to me, tracing the lines with his finger, explaining the history of each contested edge. It had been one of the evenings when the space between us still felt bridgeable, when I had believed that being included in his world meant I had a place inside it. "The council has been building a case," he said. "Since before you left, if I'm being honest. Edric and 2 others, Councillor Price and the newer one, Aldrin, have been pushing for the formal separation to clear the way for a strategic alliance. I was quiet for a moment. An alliance, I repeated. You mean a political marriage? They have someone in mind, the daughter of the Greywood Alpha. It would consolidate the eastern border territories, resolve the patrol tensions that have been escalating for the past year. He said it, the way he said everything difficult, flatly, without editorializing, as though if the words were plain enough, they wouldn't cut. They've been patient. They've been waiting for the paperwork to be finalized. The fire in the hearth was the only sound in the room for a moment. And now I've arrived, I said, 8 months along, and disrupted the schedule. Yes. And Edric is worried that I'm going to use the pregnancy to delay the dissolution and complicate the alliance. Yes. Is that what you think I'm doing? He looked up from the maps, met my eyes directly, the way he had done last night in the moment before I stepped back. No, he said. I don't think that. I held his gaze for a count of 3. Then I moved toward the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down, because my back was already protesting the morning, and I was not going to stand through this conversation out of pride. Then tell me what you do think, I said. Because I came here to finish something cleanly, and now there are council politics and alliance negotiations, and a man who implied in a corridor last night that my child might not be yours. And I need to understand what I'm actually walking into before I sign anything. Sebastian was quiet for a long moment. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat, which surprised me. Sebastian standing was his default position in difficult conversations, the physical advantage of height used without apparent thought. Sitting across from me felt deliberate, an intentional leveling. I made a mistake, he said. The simplicity of it caught me entirely off guard. The letter, he continued, the way I handled it. I told myself it was the clean solution, that dragging it out would be harder for both of us, that you deserved a clear answer rather than months more of what we'd already been living. I told myself a lot of things that were easier than admitting that I didn't know how to fix what had gone wrong between us, and I was afraid of what would happen if I tried and failed again. I looked at him across the table, at the maps between us and the morning light and the evidence of everything this room had held over the years, arguments and plans and long evenings of working silence that I had once mistaken for intimacy. That's the most honest thing you've said to me in a very long time, I said quietly. I know. He looked down at his hands briefly. It should have come earlier. Yes, I said. It should have. The fire shifted. Outside, voices crossed the courtyard, the ordinary sounds of the pack day continuing regardless of what was being dismantled and rebuilt in this library. I thought about Mira, and her candle shop, and Thursday dinners, and the small, decent life I had constructed in Westmeir. I thought about the specific freedom of not waiting for someone to see you, of not measuring your worth by whether the most important person in the room had turned in your direction. I had learned that freedom the hard way. I was not willing to give it back cheaply. What do you want, Sebastian? I asked. Not what Edric wants. Not what the Council's alliance requires. What do you actually want? He didn't answer immediately. That was one of the things that had always distinguished him from lesser men. The refusal to give fast answers to questions that deserved slow ones. He sat with it, visibly, the way someone handles something fragile and heavy at the same time. I want... He started. Stopped. Tried again. I want the chance to be different from what I was. I don't know if that's something you have any reason to believe, and I'm not asking you to believe it based on one morning in a library. But I need you to know that seeing you last night, knowing what I missed, what I was too closed off and too pressured and too much of a coward to see coming. You weren't a coward, I said, surprising myself. You were someone who didn't know how to ask for help and had too much to protect to learn. He looked at me sharply, as though the clemency was unexpected. That's more generous than I deserve, he said. Probably, I agreed. But it's true. Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically, not the thunderclap of cinematic reconciliation. Something quieter. The way pressure equalizes when a window is finally opened, the air on both sides finding the same temperature. Edric is going to make things difficult, I said. Whatever we decide about the documents, about the child's status, he's going to push back. Let him, Sebastian said. The flat certainty of it was different from his earlier controlled quiet. This wasn't suppression. This was decision. The child's acknowledgement isn't a council matter. It's mine. And I'm not going to stand in a room while a political strategist implies that He stopped. Something worked in his jaw. That our child is in question. Our child. He had said it without apparent calculation, like a fact being stated. I pressed my palm against my stomach under the table, a private gesture, grounding myself. I'm not moving back into the keep, I said, clearly. I need you to understand that. Not right now, and not until I trust that things are genuinely different, and not just different because the situation changed. What happened between us didn't happen overnight, and it doesn't get repaired overnight. I know, he said. But I'm willing, I continued carefully, to not sign the papers today. To give this, whatever this is, a period of honest assessment. Not for the council. Not for the alliance they're trying to engineer. For the child. And for the possibility that you mean what you're saying. Sebastian held my gaze across the table. Across the maps of every territory he had spent his life defending. Across the distance of 7 months and 12 lines and everything that had been lost in the silence between us. I mean it, he said. The council meeting was at 10. I did not attend it. But Darian told me afterward, when he brought me lunch in the library where I had stayed to read through the morning, that Sebastian had walked into the chamber, set the unsigned separation documents in front of Edric, and informed the council that the proceedings were suspended pending review, that the Alpha's child would be formally registered and acknowledged before the end of the month, and that the Greywood Alliance negotiation was to be paused indefinitely. Edric had reportedly said, "You're making a serious error." Sebastian had reportedly said, "I made the serious error 7 months ago. This is the correction." Darian delivered this information with the carefully neutral expression of a man who was in fact not neutral at all. And when he finished, he picked up the empty lunch tray and walked to the door and paused. "For what it's worth," he said. "I told him at the time that the letter was the wrong call." "Why didn't he listen?" I asked. Darian considered this for a moment. "Because he was afraid," he said simply. And he trusted his fear more than he trusted himself. He left. I sat with the books and the afternoon light coming through the tall windows and the weight of a future that had, sometime between last night and this morning, stopped being entirely finished and started being something else entirely. Something unwritten, frightening, quietly, stubbornly possible. Outside, the clouds had broken at last. A long band of pale winter sunlight crossed the courtyard and reached the library window and lay across the maps on the table like something deliberate. I let it warm my hands. The baby came 6 weeks later, in the middle of a snowstorm. Not in Westmeir. I had gone back, as planned, 3 days after the library conversation. Sebastian had walked me to the gate himself, which was not something the Alpha King of the Iron Vale territories typically did, and the stable hands and patrol wolves who witnessed it had the collective expression of people watching something they would be discussing for a long time. He had not made grand declarations at the gate. He had carried my bag to the horse and helped me mount with a steadiness that asked nothing in return. And then he had looked up at me in the gray morning light and said, "I'll come to Westmeir. When you're ready. You tell me when." I had nodded. I had ridden away without looking back, because I knew if I looked back, I would read too much into whatever expression he was wearing, and I was not ready to build new structures on foundations I hadn't yet tested. I told Mira everything when I got home. She listened over Thursday dinner. A good thick soup this time, because the cold had arrived properly and she had decided I needed feeding up. And when I finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at me for a long moment, with the particular expression of a woman who has seen enough of the world to know that hope and foolishness live very close to each other, and the difference between them is mostly patience. "What do you feel?" she asked. "Terrified," I said honestly, "and something else that I don't have a word for yet." She nodded as though that was the right answer. Sebastian came to Westmeir 2 weeks later. He came alone. No escort, no beta guard, no official entourage, just Sebastian Voss on a dark horse on a Wednesday morning, arriving at the market square like an ordinary person. Which he so profoundly was not that several of the market vendors simply stopped what they were doing and stared. He had found the candle shop without apparent difficulty, which meant he had either asked directions or had been learning the geography of my new life before he arrived. And I chose not to examine too closely which of those possibilities said more. Mira met him at the door before I could. I heard her voice from upstairs, where I had been resting, careful, assessing, with the particular energy of a woman determining whether someone was worth the air he was breathing. And then his voice, lower, answering whatever she had said. A pause. Then her footsteps on the stairs. She appeared in my doorway with flour on her hands again, and an expression I couldn't entirely read. "He brought food," she said. "Good cheese, 2 kinds of bread, something wrapped in paper that smells like smoked fish. Either he researched what you've been eating, or he has excellent instincts." "He researched," I said. She nodded slowly. "He asked me if there was anything you needed before he asked if he could see you." I sat up carefully, one hand pressed to my lower back. "Send him up," I said. Those 2 weeks had the quality of something being rebuilt from the ground up, slowly and without shortcuts. Sebastian came to Westmeir twice more before the birth, once for an afternoon that extended into evening, because Mira simply kept adding food to the table, and nobody addressed the fact that he should probably leave, and once for a longer visit during which he helped me sort through the small pile of things I had accumulated for the baby, sitting on the floor of my room with his long legs folded beneath him, holding up a tiny knitted blanket with an expression of such genuine bewilderment at its smallness that I laughed for the first time in what felt like months. The laugh surprised both of us. He looked up when it happened. Something in his face went very soft. "There it is," he said quietly. "There, what is? That." He didn't elaborate, just looked at me for a moment the way he had in the library, present and unarmored, before returning his attention to the blanket with exaggerated focus, as though embarrassed by his own openness. We talked during those visits. Really talked. Not the managed conversations of our marriage, the ones that had stayed carefully on the surface of things, the pack business, and the schedule, and the logistical architecture of shared life. We talked about the early parts, about what had gone wrong, and when and how each of us had experienced the widening of the distance from our own side of it. It was not comfortable. Some of it was painful in the specific way that truth is painful when it has been waiting a long time to be said. But it was honest, and honesty, I had learned, was the only foundation worth building on. He told me about the council pressure. Not as excuse, he was careful about that, and I noticed, but as context. The eastern border had been deteriorating for nearly 2 years before the letter, and Edric's faction had been using every instability as leverage, pushing Sebastian toward the Greywood Alliance, arguing that an Omega Luna was a political liability in a time that required strategic marriages and consolidated power. Sebastian had listened to them for longer than he should have. He had started seeing our marriage through their framework instead of his own, measuring its worth in terms of territorial advantage and pack optics, until the thing itself had become invisible inside the argument about it. "I stopped seeing you," he said, on the second visit, in the early evening with the candle smell rising through the floor and the wind at the windows. "I don't mean..." He paused, finding the words. "I mean I stopped seeing what was actually there. I was looking at the space you occupied in a larger picture, and I lost the picture that was just you." I was quiet for a moment, I stopped asking you to see me, I said. After a while. It became easier to be invisible than to keep trying to be visible and failing. He absorbed that. I know. I need you to understand that I'm not that person anymore, I said. The one who made herself smaller. Whatever this is between us going forward, I don't do that anymore. I won't. Good, he said. Simply, immediately, like it wasn't even a question. I don't want you to. The snow began on a Thursday evening, which felt appropriate. I went into labor at 2 a.m. with Mira beside me and a midwife named Petra, who had been tending births in Westmeir for 30 years and had hands like certainty itself. It was long and exhausting, and at some point around dawn, Mira sent word to Iron Vale, and Sebastian arrived covered in snow and entirely undone by the simple fact of a closed door and the sounds coming from behind it, and Darian, who had apparently ridden with him, had to physically redirect him to a chair and put something hot in his hands. I learned all of this afterward. What I knew in the moment was only the immediacy of it, the work of it, the strange animal focus that narrowed the world to a single point, and then the point resolved. And Petra placed something in my arms that was warm and outraged and already fighting the indignity of being new, and the world expanded again into something larger than it had been before. A girl. She had dark hair, surprising against the pale skin, a full and furious voice, and fingers so small and precise they looked like arguments for the existence of intention in the universe. I held her against my chest, and she stopped crying almost immediately, settled into the warmth of it, turned her face inward, became suddenly, completely still, and something in me came to rest that I hadn't realized had been moving continuously for the better part of a year. Mira was crying at the foot of the bed. She denied it immediately when I looked at her. Sebastian came in when Petra opened the door. He stopped just inside the threshold. He was still wearing his riding coat, snow melting in his braids, and he looked at the two of us, at me, and at the small, dark-haired person settled against my chest, with an expression that I knew I would carry for the rest of my life. Not the controlled authority of the Alpha King. Not the careful distance of the man who had sent 12 lines on expensive paper. Something altogether different. Something that had no politics in it, no strategy, no calculation. Just a man, seeing his daughter for the first time. I held her out toward him. He crossed the room and took her with a care so absolute it made Mira start crying again, which she denied again more strenuously. He held her the way he had held my stomach in the main hall weeks ago, completely still, as though listening. She turned her face toward the warmth of him and yawned enormously, and went back to sleep. Ren, I said. I had been thinking about it for weeks. If you agree. He looked up from her face. His eyes were bright in a way I had not seen before. Ren, he repeated, like he was learning the shape of it. It means something small that makes a large sound, I said. He laughed. A real one, low and unguarded and slightly helpless, the kind I had almost never heard from him during our marriage, and had heard twice in the past 2 weeks and was beginning to understand was the truest sound he made. Perfect, he said. The separation papers were formally withdrawn 6 weeks after Ren's birth. Not because Sebastian asked me to withdraw them, and not because the council, Edric most vocally, Price more quietly, had ceased applying pressure. They had not ceased. The Greywood Alliance negotiation had been formally abandoned, which had made Edric's displeasure loud enough to reach Westmeir on the wind, and there had been 2 formal council challenges to Sebastian's decision that he had handled with the quiet, immovable certainty of someone who had found the floor of himself, and was no longer afraid of standing on it. I withdrew them because I chose to. Because Sebastian had driven to Westmeir in a snowstorm to sit in a chair outside a door and be undone by it, and because he had held our daughter with the absolute care of someone receiving something sacred, and because he had come back every week since, and helped Mira with her Thursday dinners, and let Ren sleep on his chest while I rested, and had never once made me feel that returning was a debt I owed him, rather than a choice I was free to make. Because I had spent 7 months learning to need nothing from anyone who hadn't earned it. And he had earned it. I moved back to Iron Vale in the spring, when Wren was 8 weeks old, and the hills were turning green, and the road was dry enough to travel comfortably. Not back to the North Tower, Sebastian had asked, but I had said not yet, and he had accepted it immediately, which told me more about who he was now than any declaration could have. I took the East Wing room that had been mine during that first night. We rebuilt our proximity slowly, in the patient way that real things are built, without shortcuts. Darian, for his part, was insufferably pleased about all of it. He managed to communicate this while maintaining perfect professional composure, which was an impressive performance that I made a point of appreciating aloud, which made Sebastian laugh again. Edric resigned from the council 3 months later, citing health concerns that everyone understood were political in nature. Councillor Price, pragmatic above all else, adjusted his position with the philosophical flexibility of a man who knew how to read which direction the tide was running. The younger councillor, Aldrin, turned out to be a reasonable person once the factional pressure was removed. He brought Wren a carved wooden bird at her first pack presentation and looked genuinely delighted when she tried to put it in her mouth. The eastern border tensions, which had been the original justification for all the alliance maneuvering, were resolved not through a strategic marriage, but through a series of direct negotiations that Sebastian conducted over the following months with the Greywood Alpha himself, man to man, territory to territory, without the political instrumentalization of anyone's daughter. It took longer. It held better. The last evening I want to tell you about happened in October, when Wren was 7 months old. We were in the library. The real one. The good one. With the tall windows and the beeswax smell and the maps on the central table. Wren was asleep in a basket near the hearth, entirely unimpressed by the grandeur of her surroundings, which was a quality I intended to encourage. Sebastian was at the table, working through patrol reports, his braids loose, his reading posture the same one I had memorized years ago. Left hand flat on the table, right hand holding the page, a slight forward lean when something caught his attention. I was in the chair by the window, reading, my feet tucked beneath me, the fire warm against the evening cold. It was quiet in the particular way that the library was always quiet, the good kind, the kind with no held breath in it. At some point, Sebastian looked up from his reports. He looked at Wren, sleeping, then at me. And he held that gaze for a moment, with the expression I had come to know best on his face. The unarmored one, the one he didn't show the council, or the patrol captains, or the political architecture of everything that required him to be immovable. The one that was just him. "Thank you," he said, quietly, "for coming back." I looked at him across the library, across the maps and the firelight and the sleeping daughter and all the distance we had crossed, to be sitting in the same room like this, like something ordinary, like something that would simply continue. "Thank you," I said, "for being worth coming back to." Wren made a small sound in her basket. The fire settled. Outside, the October wind moved through the dark trees on the hills, and the keep stood solid around us, full of its cedar and leather smell, full of its history and its complications, and its slow, stubborn capacity for change. I turned back to my book. Sebastian turned back to his reports. And that was how it ended. Not in a thunderclap, not in a declaration, but in the simple, unshakable weight of 2 people who had found their way back to the same room and chosen, every day since, to stay in it. That was enough. That was everything.